At 5:40 in the evening on July 1 Street, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt picked up the telephone in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a grand chateau just west of Paris that had once belonged to French royalty. The fading daylight filtered through tall windows onto maps covered with red and blue markings representing the battered German and advancing Allied forces across Normandy. On the other end of the line was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command. Calling from the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia over 1,000 miles away, Keitel wanted to know the situation in Normandy. His voice carried the nervous tension of a man who would soon have to repeat whatever he heard to a leader increasingly detached from military reality. 25 days had passed since the Allied landings on June 6. The Americans had just captured Cherbourg, the deep water port that would soon allow them to funnel supplies into France at an industrial pace. The British were grinding their way toward Caen, the key city controlling the road network into the French interior. German casualties were catastrophic: killed, wounded, missing, captured. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Replacements were not coming. The Luftwaffe could not contest the skies. The front was collapsing inch by inch, day by day. Keitel asked the question Hitler had been demanding for weeks: what should we do? Von Rundstedt paused. The line crackled with static. At 68 years old, he was the senior field marshal in the German army, a professional soldier who had served the German state for more than half a century under 3 different governments. He had commanded the conquest of Poland in 35 days. He had led Army Group South through Ukraine in 1941. Advancing 400 miles in 3 months. He had overseen the defense of Western Europe since 1942. He had studied war his entire adult life. Within days, Vonnet was relieved of command. Hitler replaced him with Field Marshal Gavagnaga, a capable officer who would prove no more able to reverse the situation than von Rundstedt had been. The war would continue for another 10 months. Millions more would die. German cities would be reduced to rubble. The Red Army would fight its way to Berlin, exacting a terrible revenge for the horrors Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. And the man who had seen the truth, spoken it plainly, and been removed for his honesty, would watch from retirement as everything he predicted came to pass, exactly as he had foreseen. What happened in those 25 days between D-Day and that phone call reveals something profound about how military organizations fail when honesty becomes punishable. It shows what happens when the men at the top refuse to listen to the men who can actually see the battlefield. And it demonstrates a truth that applies far beyond warfare. The people closest to a problem often understand it best, but the people farthest from it often have the most power to ignore them, and the most incentive to do so. To understand why Von Rundstedt said what he said, and why it cost him his command, you have to understand what he had been watching since the spring of 1944, and what kind of man he was. Gerd von Rundstedt was born on December 12, 1875 in Ashes, Lebanon, a small town in Prussian Saxony. His family had produced officers for the Prussian and German states for generations. Military service was not a career choice for the von Rundstedts. It was a family tradition, an obligation of class, an identity. His father had served as a lieutenant in the Hesse and later rose to the rank of general. His grandfather had fought against Napoleon. The expectation that young Gerd would become an officer was as natural as the expectation that he would learn to read. He entered the German army as a cadet in March 1892 at age 16. By 1914, when the Great War began, he was a captain serving on the staff of an army corps. He spent the war in staff positions, learning the art of moving large formations, coordinating artillery and infantry, managing the logistics that determined whether armies advanced or starved. He never achieved fame as a frontline commander, but he developed a reputation for methodical competence, clear thinking, and an ability to remain calm when situations deteriorated. After Germany's defeat in 1918, von Rundstedt stayed in the small, professional army that the Versailles Treaty permitted Germany to maintain. He rose steadily through the ranks. By 1932, he commanded a cavalry division. By 1936, he was one of the most senior generals in the German military. When Hitler came to power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already an established figure, a representative of the old Prussian military aristocracy that predated the Nazi movement by centuries. Von Rundstedt was not a Nazi. He never joined the party. He never expressed enthusiasm for National Socialist ideology. He viewed Hitler with a mixture of professional distance and aristocratic contempt. Among fellow officers, he called Hitler the Bohemian Corporal, a reference to Hitler's modest rank in the Great War and his Austrian origins. Von Rundstedt considered himself a soldier of Germany, not a soldier of any political movement. His loyalty was to the state, to the army, to the traditions of Prussian military service. Politicians came and went. The army endured, but von Rundstedt was also a man of his time and class, which meant he was willing to serve whoever controlled the German state, regardless of their methods or goals. When Hitler launched the war, von Rundstedt fought it. He did not question whether the war was just. He did not resign in protest when Germany invaded Poland, a country with which Germany had signed a non-aggression pact only months earlier. He simply did his job, and he was brilliant at it. His campaign in Poland in September 1939 was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. He commanded Army Group South, driving from Silesia toward Warsaw with speed and precision. His forces covered 200 meters in 2 weeks, encircling Polish armies and preventing them from establishing coherent defensive lines. The campaign was over in 35 days. Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation. In May 1940, von Rundstedt led Army Group A in the invasion of France. His forces made the crucial thrust through the Ardennes, the forested highlands of Belgium, and Luxembourg that French planners had dismissed as impossible to tanks. 7 panzer divisions drove through the narrow roads and emerged behind the main French defensive positions. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered. It was the greatest German military victory since the Wars of Unification in the 19th century. In June 1941, von Rundstedt commanded Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces drove through Ukraine, covering 400 meters in 3 months, capturing Kiev in one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the Kiev pocket alone. Von Rundstedt's reputation as one of Germany's finest commanders was secure, but von Rundstedt also saw something that the ideologues in Berlin refused to see. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, was not surrendering. New divisions appeared to replace those destroyed. Soviet industry evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains continued to produce tanks and aircraft. The winter of 1941 brought the German advance to a halt outside Moscow. The quick victory Hitler had promised was not coming. In December 1941, von Rundstedt ordered a withdrawal from Rostov, a city in southern Russia that his forces could no longer hold. Hitler was furious. He had forbidden any retreats. Von Rundstedt offered his resignation and Hitler accepted it. For the first time, the field marshal learned what happened to commanders who told Hitler things he did not want to hear. But Germany needed von Rundstedt. In March 1942, Hitler recalled him and appointed him Commander-in-Chief West. His job was to prepare the defense of the Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain, nearly 3,000 miles of coastline. The Allies would eventually invade. Everyone knew it. The question was where and when, and whether Germany could defeat the invasion when it came. Von Rundstedt commanded dozens of divisions on paper. In reality, many were understrength, undertrained, or filled with soldiers who had no business being on a front line. Some divisions consisted primarily of older men, conscripted in their 40s after younger men had been killed or captured in the East. Other divisions contained Osttroppen, soldiers from the conquered territories of the Soviet Union who had volunteered or been coerced into German service. Their reliability was questionable. Their equipment was often obsolete. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. Allied bombers struck German industry by day and by night, and the fighter forces that tried to stop them were being ground down in a battle of attrition. They could not win. The Marine had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats still sailed, but they were being sunk faster than they could be built, and the convoy routes bringing American men and material to Britain were flowing freely. Von Rundstedt was being asked to hold a continent with an army that was already bleeding to death in the east against enemies who controlled the sea and the sky, with no prospect of reinforcement and no margin for error. He understood the mathematics of the situation. He understood that Germany's strategic position was deteriorating every month. But he was a soldier, and soldiers do their duty. He would prepare the best defense he could and hope that circumstances might change. The fundamental problem was resources. Germany did not have enough men, enough tanks, enough aircraft, or enough fuel to defend everywhere at once. The Atlantic coast stretched for thousands of miles. The Allies could land almost anywhere. Decisions. Trying to spread armored units along the entire coast would make them too weak everywhere to be decisive anywhere. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to command Army Group B under von Rundstedt in November 1943, completely disagreed. Rommel had fought the British and Americans in North Africa. He knew exactly what Allied air power could do. He had watched his supply convoys burn on the desert roads to Tobruk. He had seen his tanks destroyed by fighter bombers before they could even reach the battlefield. He had experienced firsthand the devastating effects of naval gunfire on coastal defenses. Rommel believed that once the Allies secured a foothold on French soil, German armor would never reach the beaches. Allied aircraft would obliterate any panzer column on the roads. Allied naval guns would break apart any counterattack before it ever reached the front line. The only chance, Rommel argued, was to crush the invasion in the first hours on the beaches themselves before the Allies could consolidate. Every tank, every gun, every soldier needed to be positioned as close to the shoreline as possible. The invasion had to be stopped at the water's edge, or it would never be stopped at all. Rommel famously told his staff that the first 24 hours would be decisive for both the Allies and Germany. It will be the longest day, he said. Both men had valid arguments. Von Rundstedt's classical strategic approach had been proven throughout military history. Rommel's assessment of Allied air and naval dominance was equally accurate. A true compromise might have offered Germany its best chance. But Hitler, characteristically, chose the worst possible option. He compromised by keeping personal control over key panzer divisions. The Panzer-Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division could not move without Hitler's direct authorization. This stripped frontline commanders of critical flexibility. It meant that when the invasion came, the men who could actually see what was happening would have to request permission from a man 1,000 miles away who saw nothing. It meant delays. It meant confusion. It meant that the critical hours after the landings would be wasted waiting for authorization that might never come. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies landed on 5 beaches across a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. At Utah Beach. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division came ashore with relatively light casualties. At Omaha Beach, the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions ran directly into the German 352nd Infantry Division and suffered brutally. Over 2,000 killed or wounded in the opening hours. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces pushed inland against determined, but ultimately insufficient resistance. By nightfall, 156,000 men were ashore. 11,000 aircraft guarded the skies with total dominance. Nearly 7,000 ships had carried them across the Channel, the largest naval armada in history. Over 23,000 airborne troops, including 13,000 American paratroopers, had jumped or landed by glider behind the German lines during the night, seizing key bridges and road junctions, creating chaos in the German rear areas. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Von Rundstedt learned of the landings around 6:30 in the morning, when reports began filtering in from the coastal defense units. Paratroopers had been landing for hours. Naval bombardment had begun before dawn. The scope of the attack was immediately clear. This was not a raid. This was the invasion. Von Rundstedt immediately requested the release of the Panzer reserves. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Division were positioned to counterattack if given permission to move. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to strengthen their beachheads. Every hour mattered. The request went to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof in Bavaria, where he had been staying since late spring. He had stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning watching newsreels with Goebbels and Eva Braun. His personal physician had given him a sleeping pill to treat his chronic insomnia. His staff, terrified of his rages, refused to wake him. The Führer had left explicit orders not to be disturbed. Even Albert Schar, the armaments minister, who arrived at the Berghof around 10 o'clock in the morning, found Hitler still asleep. The panzers sat motionless, their engines cold, their crews waiting for orders that did not come. Hours passed. The Allies consolidated their positions. More men and more equipment came ashore. The beachheads linked up. The window for a decisive counterattack began to close when Hitler finally woke around noon. He still hesitated. He was convinced that Normandy was a diversion, that the real invasion would come at Paradala, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 21 miles from the British coast. Allied deception operations, Senemed Fortitude, had convinced German intelligence that a massive army group under General George Patton was waiting in southeast England to strike at Kallala. The entire Normandy operation, Hitler believed, was designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective. Hitler refused to release the Panzer reserves until he was certain. He kept them in place, waiting for an attack on Kallala that would never come. The deception was so effective that Hitler continued to believe in the Phantom Army for weeks after D-Day, holding back forces that could have been committed in Normandy. By the time the Panzers finally received authorization to move in the late afternoon, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Allied aircraft were waiting. Columns of tanks and trucks moving on French roads by daylight were easy targets. Fighter bombers struck again and again, destroying vehicles, blocking roads, creating chaos. What should have been a rapid deployment became a grinding ordeal. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to counterattack on D-Day, launched a disjointed attack that evening. One battle group actually reached the coast between the British beaches, but it was too weak to exploit the penetration. By nightfall, it had withdrawn after losing 70 of its 124 tanks. The moment to throw the Allies back into the sea had passed. It would never return. Von Rundstedt watched this unfold with growing despair. Every hour that passed allowed the Allies to land more men, more tanks, more artillery. Every hour allowed them to strengthen defensive positions and bring forward additional supplies. Every hour reduced Germany's chances of victory, and there was nothing he could do about it. The decisions were being made in Bavaria by a man who had never commanded troops in battle, who refused to visit the front, who relied on colored pins on a map to understand situations that could only be grasped by seeing them firsthand. The first week after D-Day confirmed von Rundstedt's worst fears. The Allies were not going to be pushed back. They were establishing themselves, building up their forces, preparing to break out into the French interior. German counterattacks failed one after another. The 12th SS Panzer Division, when it finally arrived, launched attacks that caused heavy Allied casualties, but failed to dislodge the beachhead. Panzer Division, one of Germany's best equipped armored formations, was fed into the fighting piecemeal and began to suffer losses it could never replace. Reinforcements were delayed by Allied air attacks on French railways and bridges. The systematic destruction of the French rail network had been underway for months before D-Day. Now, its effects were fully felt. Divisions that should have reached Normandy in days took weeks. The French resistance added to the chaos, cutting telephone lines, ambushing convoys, providing intelligence to Allied forces. The front was stabilizing, but it was stabilizing in favor of the enemy. On June 17, 11 days after the landing, von Rundstedt and Rommel met with Hitler at Maraval, a command bunker complex near Soissons known as Wolfluck II that had been built in 1940 for the planned invasion of Britain. It was the only time Hitler would ever use this facility. It was also the first time Hitler had been to France since the armistice in 1940. He had refused to visit the front despite repeated requests from his commanders. Now he came, but only to a bunker far behind the lines, protected by layers of security. He had flown from Bosch's garden to Metz the previous day, then traveled by motorcade overnight. Hitler arrived, looking pale and exhausted, his hands trembling visibly. He walked with a stoop. His famous energy had given way to a nervous agitation that alarmed the officers who saw him. Later, it would be understood that he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, though at the time, the symptoms were attributed to stress and overwork. Rommel spoke first. He described the situation with brutal honesty. The front was barely holding. Casualties were running at 2,500 men per day, and replacements were arriving at a rate of perhaps 1,000. The Allies had complete air superiority. German soldiers could not move, could not resupply, could not reinforce in daylight without being attacked from the air. Every day, the Allied buildup grew stronger, while German strength diminished. The mathematics of the situation were undeniable. Unless something changed dramatically, the front would eventually collapse. Rommel urged Hitler to consider the political implications. If the war in the West could not be won militarily, perhaps a diplomatic solution should be sought. Perhaps negotiations might preserve something of Germany's position before total collapse made any negotiation impossible.